Muy buenas amigos de Ready para Exportar. Usualmente nosotros asistimos a la conferencia internacional de la Asociación Latinoamericana de Exportadores de Servicios y le traemos a ustedes algunas entrevistas de algunos de los expertos en esta conferencia, sobre todo con los temas que afectan la exportación de servicios para nuestra región de América Latina y del Caribe. Este año, el evento del Foro ALES se celebró en Florianópolis, Brasil, y contó con la participación de muchos expertos, no solamente de América Latina y expertos internacionales. Yo tuve el honor de coordinar el panel sobre las oportunidades que tiene América Latina, pero de cara a un contexto internacional difícil. Tuvimos expertos de la Unión Europea, la Organización Mundial del Comercio, de Brasil, y tuvimos a un profesor, historiador, acaba de completar una investigación de las guerras comerciales a lo largo de la historia, desde la antigua Grecia hasta nuestros días, lo que él plantea, la guerra China-Estados Unidos en ese contexto. Lo que los expertos nos dicen es que nos esperan años de mucha tensión geopolítica. Se está hablando de la geoeconomía, que es el uso de la geopolítica como arma comercial, algo totalmente nuevo y que ya algunos gobiernos y algunas grandes corporaciones están contratando geoeconomistas en jefe para tratar de entender, para desmenuzar cómo las decisiones que hay, pero sobre todo el tablero que se juega China, Estados Unidos. Y nosotros entrevistamos al profesor Craig VanGrasstek, que es este autor de esta obra sobre guerras comerciales, que saldrá en el 2026, publicado por la Universidad de Cambridge, pero que dio la primicia en este evento de ALES sobre esta guerra y que nos dice que va un poco para largo y que ha hecho un cuadro de dónde están los países de América Latina y el Caribe y sobre todo países como los nuestros que son tan dependientes de comercio de los Estados Unidos, pues tenemos una alta vulnerabilidad según el cuadro del profesor. Y entonces tomamos unos momentos para conversar con él, para hacerle algunas preguntas, dar un poco sobre lo que plantea en su libro y en esta perspectiva. Lo cual no quiere decir que nuestro sector y nuestra región no tengan opciones. También en este evento se hablaron de cómo el sector servicio todavía no está siendo afectado fuertemente por estos cambios, por lo menos los que han habido hasta el momento, y cómo podemos como región, si fortalecemos más el comercio intrarregional, cómo podemos amainar un poco los riesgos de esta guerra comercial. Uno de los puntos importantes en este evento fue que en el contexto de ALES se creó un grupo para el diálogo América Latina-Caribe, donde República Dominicana, la coalición de servicios de la República Dominicana va a jugar un papel importante de coordinador entre ambas regiones, de manera que podamos aumentar más ese comercio de servicio intrarregional y podamos entonces tener una mayor diversificación de nuestras exportaciones y un poco de menos vulnerabilidad a lo que pase en contextos internacionales de los cuales la República Dominicana pues no tiene ningún control y que pues somos espectadores. Vamos a escuchar la entrevista con el profesor VanGrasstek sobre su libro, sobre cómo ve estas perspectivas, porque entendemos que es una primicia mundial que le está dando de su investigación y que puede ser de mucho interés de todos ustedes.
Muy buenas amigos de Ready para Exportar. Estamos desde Florianópolis, Brasil, trayéndoles a ustedes algunas de las novedades de ALES, el Foro ALES 2025. Estamos con uno de los expertos que Craig VanGrasstek es un autor de un libro muy importante que recoge las historias de las guerras comerciales, on Trade Wars. Explícanos un poco de qué se trata el libro y por qué es importante ver la historia para entender lo que está pasando ahora con las guerras comerciales entre Estados Unidos y China.
Well, I began working on this book 2 years ago when it was apparent to me that we were going to have a renewed trade war between the United States and China. But my experiences as a political scientist and an historian, and my instinct was that we could get guidance on the present and the future by looking at the past. So in the same way that 11 years ago, 12 years ago, I wrote the history of the WTO for the WTO. If now we've moved from the WTO to trade wars, it was time to write a history. So I say that going back to the first trade war we know about, which is what was related to the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Athens, going through the 20th century, looking at the conflicts between Great Britain and Germany, all of these would give us clues as to how this particular trade war is being fought. And after looking at it for some time, I was able to realize both what is similar and what is different. And what's very important to understand about what is very different about this trade war is that both of the leading countries in this war are less dependent on trade than people think they are, which makes both of them, the United States and China, better able to fight this war longer than would be good for the rest of the world.
And you establish there are different type of countries depending on that position. Where is Latin America and the Caribbean?
Well, most countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, with a very important exception, which is Brazil, but most countries in Latin America and the Caribbean are very dependent upon trade. That would not have been the case 2 generations ago. If you go back to the 1950s, 1960s, it was very popular in many Latin American countries to try to develop autonomously. Most Latin American countries became much more trade-oriented, especially in the 1980s, looking at how Asian countries had benefited from an external orientation. Brazil didn't really make that change, and Brazil can better afford to be domestically oriented because it's such a large economy. But most small economies, in order to be efficient, they have to trade with their neighbors. Over time, Latin American and Caribbean countries that were very strongly encouraged by the United States to be more externally oriented are now in a position where if global markets begin to close or if they become more manipulated by discrimination, this is very bad for the development prospects of most Latin American and Caribbean countries.
And in light of that, it is less trade the answer, more trade among us?
The answer depends in part on whether we expect the current trade war, as I say, to continue for a long time. Now, to the extent that it is driven largely by Donald Trump, there's the question of how long Donald Trump remains in power. And for that, there are a number of variables that are outside my ability to consider. Although I would say there is a possibility that he will not serve the entirety of his 4-year term, but that's purely speculation. Even if Donald Trump leaves office, however, Trumpism may continue. And both because I think this path has become popular in the United States and because of the special configuration of the trade war between the United States and China, it is a safer bet to assume that this is going to be a long-running trade war. So what I think developing countries in Latin America and other regions have to think about is not less trade or more trade, but what kind of trading system? Can we reinvigorate the World Trade Organization, which everyone understands is in serious trouble today? Would it help if the United States were no longer a member of the WTO? Or is there some other way that countries can coordinate their actions so that the Trump administration does not pick them off one by one, threatening and forcing individual countries to make deals? And part of the problem for Latin American countries is you have a very wide spectrum of some countries that are very dependent on trade specifically with the United States, other countries that are not very dependent, and of course the United States is dealing primarily with the ones that are more dependent. So what it really becomes is a collective action problem. How can countries act collectively? And so far at least, we've seen that countries are much more interested in acting individually than collectively, and that's a problem.
The reverse domino effect
Yes.
that could affect
Yes. And we used to say that for there to be an open market, the way you overcome the public goods problem, the collective action problem, is you need one leader to sponsor the openness of the trading system, and that was the United States. But what happens when that one leader becomes the disruptor of the system? So what we need now is to think about ways that countries can they act more collectively in order to defend their wider interests in a more open trading system? Personally, as a political scientist, I'm skeptical whether it's easy to do that.
History doesn't teach us that.
No. History teaches us that the shape of the trading system is determined primarily by the interests of the largest, most influential countries, which remains the United States, despite the fact that the United States is withdrawing from leadership as we used to understand the meaning of the word leadership.
So you don't see a realignment like others see?
Well, there are some who see a realignment in trade with China. One thing we didn't talk about today, not all trade is the same. And the export interests of developing countries to China is vastly different from the export interests of developing countries to the United States. If you export to China, most likely you are exporting raw materials or semi-processed goods and importing finished goods. If you're exporting to the United States, a lot of it will be finished goods. So realignment in principle perhaps, but I don't think in the interests of most developing countries.
Esperamos que la entrevista haya sido de su interés y lo esperamos la próxima semana en Ready para Exportar y en Metrópolis.